Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the uses of gender roles. Now, I think gender roles get a very negative rap, and there are historical contexts as to why. A lot of them, if you want to be honest about it, have to do with the changing implications of modern technology. That is to say, as technology has changed, the implications of what is work and how much work it is and various things have changed with it to a degree. And that's caused various issues, historically speaking. But leaving those aside, I just want to talk about the broader concept, because this is one case where the broader concept has been much maligned in sometimes fair ways, but also unfair ways, and I want to concentrate on that, just for the sake of explanation. So, the super brief background you need to know about gender roles for those who don't actually, aren't married with children, is that when you have a household where you're married and have children, especially young children in it, there is an enormous amount of work to do, a truly enormous amount of work that needs to get done. And to give just sort of a tip of the iceberg thing, just in feeding, somebody has to get the food, and actually before that, someone has to figure out what food to get, because feeding people is just what people are willing to eat and interested in eating that is actually nutritious for them and so on is itself actually some work. And then you have to get the food, and then you have to prepare the food, and then you have to serve the food, and you have to make the children actually come and keep them there as they want to wander away and do other things, and then you have to make them eat the food. I actually occasionally have to tell children, my children, I mean, not other people's children, the food goes in your mouth, remember? And then they go, oh, okay, and then start eating it. It's funny how many things you have to teach people. And then you have to clean up after it, and then you have to clean up the table because little kids are messy, and then you have to clean up underneath the table because little kids are very messy. And then you have to clean up the surrounding area too, because really they're actually impressively messy. And then there's the various toys and things that weren't toys but they used as toys and so on that are everywhere that you have to clean up approximately every several hours, or realistically once a day, once a week, whatever. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's an enormous amount of work that goes into running an actual household and keeping it functioning in a way that's conducive not only to the survival of the people in it, but even to their happiness, if you want to be ambitious about it. So, the question immediately comes up, who is going to do what work? Now, it'd be wonderful if the children did a bunch of that work, but that's older children. Fairly older children. Remarkably older children, and it's going to depend on them too, because the thing about people is everybody has the things they like and don't like, and love to do, and hate to do. Now, chores almost invariably fall somewhere on the derive a little bit of satisfaction from to hate to do range of things. But that very fact means that everyone will get along best if you allocate things on the basis of what are people competent at. That's especially important for little children, but does apply to adults as well. In the case of anybody having any sort of, injuries, like some people have trouble being on their knees, or some people have trouble bending over for long periods of time and so on. So, you have to adjust for that, etc. But there's a lot of things where, like, I don't really mind this, you hate doing it, so I'll do it. I really loathe doing this, would you please do it, sorts of negotiations that have to go on. And this is true even if everybody is acting in good faith and trying to be generous. Because even saints are going to have personalities, and therefore things that they don't mind doing, things that they derive satisfaction from, and so on. And so it's going to take a different tenor and going to work much better if two saints are negotiating these things, but they still need to negotiate. And there comes in gender roles. Because the thing is, negotiation is a skill. It's actually a constellation of skills. And these interpersonal skills of negotiation are things that, by and large, a lot of people are not very good at. Like many things, it's sort of normally distributed in the population. Some people are, bell curve. Some people are abysmal at it. Most people are, kind of decent at it. Some people are really good at it. And I don't mean negotiation in the sense of, like, getting as much as you can while giving up as little as possible. That is a skill set that applies to certain places. But I'm talking about just working with people and communicating effectively to really indicate what you want and don't want, and coming to a solution that both of you find, the best solution possible, given that we live in an imperfect world. That's not easy. A lot of people don't have those skills, and there's the bottom half of that population. If you look at the bell curve, where their skill at this are not really all that good. I mean, kind of workable, sort of. And that's the thing that gender roles do. Is especially historically speaking, gender roles had roughly evenly divvied up the labor. You know, there's this much labor to do, and sort of figured out, like, if one person's doing this, then there's these other things nearby that are, you know, not too much additional work for them to do, but be more work for the other person, and kind of the same thing on the other side. And roles had largely been divvied up, you know, along the lines of, if you're doing these primary tasks, then here are a bunch of other subsidiary tasks, and then some things, you know, just more became associated with one role or the other. And the benefit to this, to everybody involved, is that since you can tell which one of you is the man and which one of you is the woman, you can tell what your roles are and you can tell what your roles aren't, and vice versa, so that it takes out the negotiation. You don't need negotiating skills at that point in order to have a relatively fair distribution of the work. Thus, it happens where, you know, and especially where you have people who are, you know, not right next to perfect, somebody's lazy, the other person can tell them, if both are observing gender roles, that's your job. You're the one who's supposed to do that. You're the man. You do that thing. Or you're the woman. You do that thing. And this way, the person who is being lazy can't get away with being lazy too much. So I'm not saying this is perfect, or the ideal system. In fact, the ideal system is for people who are very good at negotiating to figure out the optimal, you know, division of labor for the two people involved. But solutions that only work for, you know, the top 5%, the top 1%, the top 10% of the population in terms of whatever, in this case in terms of negotiating skills, tend to work very badly for most of the rest of people. You see this all the time in, you know, games, sports, for example, that the rules will be modified for people who are at sub-professional levels, and in various ways that enable them to have a much more fun game, given that they're not at the top peak of their performance. You see something very similar in equipment. If you ever look at the equipment that people who are really, really, really skilled at doing something, be it carpentry or ice skating or whatever, bicycle riding, etc., use, they tend to be really hard to use. You know, like, you tend to have things that, like, that you need to have incredibly good balance to not fall over. But the flip side of that is, if you do have that incredibly good balance through 20,000 hours of practice, man, does that thing work really, really well, or go really, really fast, or allow you tremendously precise control, or whatever it is. You see this throughout life. The things that benefit experts tend to work really badly for ordinary people. And so, in a free-for-all situation, though you will get the optimal results with people who are very good at negotiating, and especially people who are not only very good at negotiating, but also very, you know, generous and not lazy and so on, that thing applied to more ordinary people with more ordinary amounts of laziness and more ordinary amounts of generosity, more ordinary amounts of negotiation, can often go very badly, where one person takes massive advantage of the other, not even necessarily intending to, just it falls out that they, you know, particular mismatch of social skills and laziness and so on works out to them taking a lot of advantage of the other. And that's the thing that traditional gender roles prevents. That it, or at least makes it much, much harder. I mean, everything has its, you know, edge cases that where one person is just really, really bad, then things fall apart. But until you hit the, like, really awful people, what you get is a much more equitable distribution of labor than you would have otherwise. Now, this does bring in, just as the minor historical note to wrap it up, the traditional gender roles were established with particular amounts of work involved in particular activities, which was true for most of human society. We've seen a lot of rapid technological changes, which of course means that the amount of work involved in something like doing the laundry has gone way, way down. And also things like the amount that you can earn enough money, etc., has gone up. Now, that said, even there, the model where, you know, the man goes off and works at his job and the woman stays home is not very accurate to most of the population throughout most of history, because most of the population were farmers who lived on their farm and worked on their farm. And it is true that it was a lot more common for the man to go out and do the heavy lifting out in the fields, but it was also fairly common for things like, a woman would tend to things closer into the home, feeding of, chickens were very common throughout the world, feeding of the small animals, etc. And at the same time, it is incredibly likely that there are all sorts of tasks within the home that a man would in fact do as well. The idea of a super rigid division itself only, I think, starts to really make sense when you have a man genuinely going away in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, going far away where he is nowhere near the home for a very long time, then coming home completely exhausted, and moreover doing that year round. Because again, with most people being farmers and so on, which is most of human tradition, farming tends to be very heavy, very, very heavy work in the planting season and the harvesting season, both of which have a lot of work to do in a very short period of time, because you need to get the crops in the ground at the right time or their growth gets stunted, and you need to harvest them when they're ripe or they'll rot or get eaten, stolen by animals, etc. So you get two big lumps at the beginning and end of really, really hard work. But in the middle, there's some work to do, and then depending on climate zones, some people have more average growing seasons. But for a lot of people, there's then the season where you don't really do much because you're just living off your stored reserves and so on. And so when you're in those lulls of work, the idea that the man would then just sit around doing nothing because heck, his job was already done back in the planting season, sounds frankly silly. I mean, it's just not how human beings interact with each other. People in families like each other for the most part to some degree and like to help each other out for the most part to some degree. So the idea that never happened, that people had rigid ideas, just doesn't fit with how humanity tended to live. It's much more as people are trying to imagine a new way to live in this new circumstance of the Industrial Revolution, where you get much, much bigger separations and strange things that happened, that things that had been traditional got way more rigid and way more codified and so on. Whereas for much of history, well, frankly, human beings are human beings, and they're going to make deals with each other. They're going to make trades with each other. They're, especially in the privacy of your own home, you're just going to do whatever works out best for the people around. So, it's something when I talk about gender roles and so on, I'm not talking about the pinnacle of rigid, written down in a book sorts of things, but rather the general sense of how things tend to go. The other thing, too, just as a small side note to really wrap this up, is when you have gender roles, you get raised with the expectation you're going to be doing certain sorts of work, and therefore doing that sort of work is something, since you've been raised with this idea, that's not going to really bother you very much. In general, what people are raised to think of as normal, they tend to just think of as normal. It's really fascinating when you talk to people from very different cultures from your own and see the things that they regard as normal, and you think they're really strange. And their response tends to be like, it's the way we live. It's normal. And in fact, we do the same thing. There are lots of great videos you can find around of people pointing out strange practices that we're just totally used to, but would horrify other people in other time periods. So again, that's the other thing. Like when you were raised to expect things will be a certain way, then when they're basically that way, it's normal. Life always has the sucky parts that you'd rather not do, but have to because getting on involves work. And so again, there isn't a friction or a frisson, between expectations and reality nearly so much, which again tends to make people, by and large, a lot more content, except for the very high end of people who are incredibly adaptable and very, can pick up any skill really easily and so on. They get along well pretty much anywhere, although they don't tend to do well in environments where they get less flexibility. So again, it's one of those things of balancing out, what allows, the top small group to flourish at the expense of most people, or vice versa, and so on. So, in conclusion, that is the right way to look at gender roles. Not that they are the ideal for everybody, but rather as a compromise designed to benefit most people, possibly at the expense of people who could do better in a different arrangement, but a minority of people who could do better in a different arrangement, and in that arrangement, most people would do a lot worse. So, I'm not, by the way, advocating that we go to something strict or something like that. It's a kind of hoping it got across kind of silly, but it's something to think about along the lines of Chesterton's fence. Great analogy if you look it up. That before you tear something down, you should know why it's there. And similarly, I do think it's a really excellent idea for everybody to be able to do everything. I happen to really like picking up skills myself, and in any event, people may live on their own for a while, in which case you have to do every single task involved in keeping yourself alive. So again, it's a very useful thing to be able to do them all, to learn them all. But if nothing else, I think it would be very beneficial if people at least thought of traditional gender roles as a reasonable default compromise that you then can use as a starting point to negotiate to the degree that you can, make the situation better for the two of you within that. But to at least not do significantly worse than that because you're trying to do this without training wheels and turn out not to be so competent. So, like everything, basically, I think it's good for people to be realistic and understand their limitations. And if you're not so limited, then great for you. And if you are, be realistic about it because you'll do a lot better that way. So, anyway, just a few thoughts on this and the use of it. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.